They took the house. They took the accounts. They took the truck, the tools with a resale sticker on them, even the good ladder out of the barn. Then my brother slid one rusted key across the kitchen table. He told me the garage was all I was ever worth. I said, okay. I picked up the key. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. That quiet almost cost me everything, because none of them noticed the toolbox at the back of that garage, welded shut along every seam by a dying man's own hand. My brother signed something in a lawyer's office a year before Dad died. He never read what was above the line. He was about to sell our father's house to the same lender that was choking his own business to death. He had no idea his own signature was sitting in a freezer bag, in a steel box, waiting on a torch. 6 weeks later, that same easy smile would freeze at a closing table in front of a woman with a notary stamp, while a slow, careful lawyer read his own handwriting back to him, word for word. But before the torch, there was the funeral. My name is Tessa Garrity. I was 31 the morning we buried my father. I did not scream. I did not beg. I have one rule. I've kept it since I was a kid standing at my father's elbow at a workbench. I don't get loud. I get level. I was about to need that rule more than I'd ever needed it in my life. The morning after we lowered Earl Garrity into the ground at Fairview Cemetery, my brother Cole sat at the head of our mother's kitchen table. He had a legal pad. He had a ruler he must have packed special, because nobody carries a ruler in a suitcase by accident. He drew 2 columns down the middle of the page, squared it up like a spreadsheet. Not a dead man's life. $600,000, he said. That's what the estate nets once the house sells and the accounts clear. He said it flat, final, like a foreman reading a head count. One column had his name at the top. One had our sister Dana's. Under each, he wrote a number with more zeros in it than either of them had ever earned honestly in a year. I watched him write those numbers calm as anything. I recognized that calm. It's the calm of a man who's already decided how a room ends before he opens his mouth in it. My column had 3 letters. Shop. Under that, in his neat block print, one more word. As is. House lists Monday, Cole said. He capped his pen like he was closing a deal. Rennick's already got a buyer lined up. Don't get sentimental about the porch. He looked at me the way you look at a kid you're handing a hand-me-down. You get the garage. Land under it's not worth the gravel, but you always did love grease under your nails, so. He shrugged. Generous as a man tipping a bellhop with somebody else's cash. Everybody wins. I want you to notice something. It mattered later. Cole said the name Rennick twice in that one sentence, and he meant 2 different things by it. First, like a buyer, then, half a breath later, like a lender. That word came out a shade too fast, like he was racing past it before anybody could ask him to explain. You don't confuse those 2 words by accident, not unless one of them scares you. I filed it. I didn't ask. Not yet. Dana finally looked up from her coffee. Tessa, it's fair, she said, soft, like she was doing me a kindness. You've been here, sure, but Dad always said the shop was yours in spirit. In spirit. My sister could fold a knife into a napkin and hand it to you smiling. Cole did the math. Cole's good with numbers. Cole's good with numbers. I almost laughed. That would have been a mistake. Laughing gets noticed, and the last thing I wanted that morning was to be noticed. I had kept Earl Garrity's books to the penny for 9 straight years. Every quart of oil, every brake job, every crumpled 20 a farmer pressed into my father's palm on a Friday, because cash was easier on both of them than a check. I knew the real math of Garrity Auto the way some people know a hymn, without even trying to remember it. Sitting at that table, looking at my brother's ruler-straight columns, I already knew his numbers were wrong somewhere. They were too clean. Real money always has a smudge on it. This page had been wiped down on purpose. I reached out and picked up the key, still warm from Cole's hand. I put it in my jeans pocket. I stood up. "Okay," I said. That was the whole speech. Dana looked almost let down, like she'd built a trap and watched the animal walk right around it. Cole leaned back in our father's chair, the one with the vinyl seat cracked down the middle. He gave me the same smile he'd given me since we were kids sharing one bathroom. The smile that says you'll thank me someday. I drove to the shop instead of answering him with my face. You have to understand what that shop was, or nothing that happened later makes any sense. Garrity Auto sits on Ash Street, 2 blocks off the courthouse square, in a farm town where the corn comes up to the edge of every yard. Everybody within 5 miles knows the name on that sign before they'd recognize your face at the grocery store. My father opened it in 1979 with a bank loan and a borrowed lift. The bay doors still had his handwriting on the inside in grease pencil. Torque specks he'd scratched down 40 years ago and never once wiped away. Some habits are load-bearing. The place smelled like cutting oil and hot brake dust, and that particular sweetness a metal building gets after baking through 40 Indiana summers. To my brother, it was junk sitting on dirt. To me, it was the only room on this earth where I had ever once been exactly enough. No apology required. I let myself in through the side door, flipped the lights on one bank at a time, the way Dad always did so the old breaker wouldn't trip. I stood there a minute in a quiet that had never once, in 31 years, felt like this. Then I did the thing I do when the floor drops out from under me. I went to work. I lit the torch to burn the damp out of a lug nut my father had left seized on the bench. While it heated, I looked down the row at a weld I'd laid on a trailer hitch 3 weeks earlier, before the hospital, before any of this. A weld is handwriting. People don't believe me when I say that, but it's true down to the letter. I can look at a bead and tell you if the man running it was rushing, or scared, or half drunk, or careful down to his bones. My father taught me to read them when I was 8. The way other fathers teach a kid to tell time. He'd run a pass, cover the start of it with his thumb, and say, "Tess, where'd I begin?" I'd point, every single time, right to the spot. He never once told me I was wrong. Not about a weld, not about anything that mattered, which is exactly why, when my eyes landed on the toolbox at the far end of the bench, my stomach did something slow and cold. The box had sat there my entire life. Heavy gray steel, the size of a small chest freezer, the kind of box a man bolts to his floor and wills to his sons. Except this one had never been bolted down. Years back, I'd come in on a Saturday and found the lid sealed. My father had run a weld all the way around the seam where the lid met the body, closed it up tight, like a jar nobody was ever meant to open again. I'd asked him why. He didn't look up from wiping his hands. "Some things you put away," he said, "so they're there when you need them." Then he changed the subject so fast I never worked up the nerve to ask twice. For years, I let it be furniture. A thing Dad did. The way you don't question a lock on a door you've never once tried the handle on. Standing there with the torch hissing quiet in my hand, one day after we buried him, I looked at that weld the way I look at every weld I've ever seen. For the first time in my life, I let myself really see it. It was his hand. No question. The rhythm was his. The little hesitation at each corner. The way he always feathered the stop so it wouldn't leave a crater. But this one was slower than anything I'd ever watched him do for a customer. My father welded fast and clean when money was on the other end of it. This he had done the way you sign your own name on something that actually matters. He had sealed that box like a man who already knew who would come looking someday. and who wouldn't bother. He had made sure whatever waited under that lid could never be slid off a bench and pocketed before anybody thought to ask a question. I shut the torch off. I stood there in the ringing quiet that comes right after. I did not open it. Not that day. I want to be honest about that part. I wasn't ready. Some part of me, the part still 11 days from being able to say the word funeral without my throat locking shut, understood that whatever sat under that lid was going to rearrange every person in my family. Once I cut it open, there would be no welding it shut again. Some doors you only get to walk through once. So I left it sealed. I locked the shop. I drove back to the house on Delphi Pike, where the porch light my father always left burning for me was still on in the middle of the afternoon. I'd flipped it on the night the hospital called, and I hadn't been able to make myself turn it off since. Cole's truck was gone from the drive. Dana's rental was gone too. On the kitchen table, right where the key had been that morning, sat a single sheet of paper, already half filled in. Cellar, and then my father's name typed out clean. Earl T. Garrity. A signature line underneath that was never going to get filled, on account of where Earl T. Garrity currently was. I read it twice standing up. The buyer's financing was arranged through a private party. The private party was named in small print at the bottom, Rennick Capital Partners, Indianapolis. There it was again. The buyer. The lender. The name Cole's jaw tightened around every time it left his mouth. I set the paper back down exactly where I'd found it, squared to the edge of the table. I didn't want anyone to know I'd read it. That's the thing about getting level instead of getting loud. A quiet person can read the whole room before the room even notices she walked in. I made myself a sandwich I never ate. I sat down in my father's chair with the cracked vinyl seat. I thought about the last real conversation the two of us ever had in that shop, about a month before he died. He was already tired in a way I'd told myself was only age catching up with him. He'd been standing at the bench, one hand resting flat on the lid of that welded box. He said something I brushed off at the time as an old man getting sentimental about a pile of steel. "Everything I built is in that shop, Tess," he'd said, and patted the lid twice with his palm. "Everything that matters, anyway. The rest is just paper. Paper goes wherever the wind decides to send it." I thought he meant the work, the reputation, 40 years of being the one man in Tipton you trusted with your transmission, and more than a few times, your secrets. I'd smiled and said, "Sure, Dad," and handed him the 9/16 wrench he was reaching for. Sitting in his chair that night, I was no longer sure he'd been talking about the work at all. Here's what I knew by the time the sun went down on the worst week of my life. I knew my brother had split $600,000 into 2 clean columns and handed me a rusted key. I knew the house was going up for sale before our father was cold, to a buyer who was somehow also a lender, a name my own brother couldn't say without his jaw going tight. I knew the figures on that legal pad were too clean to be honest. Honest money always drags a little mud in with it. And I knew there was a steel box on Ash Street, sealed with my father's careful handwriting, sitting exactly where he'd left it, untouchable, unpocketable, waiting on someone who could read it. What I didn't know yet was what cutting it open was going to cost the three of us. I'd find that out soon enough, just not that night. That night, I finally turned off the porch light. I went to bed in the only house I'd ever lived in, the one my own brother had already sold out from under me without asking, and I lay there in the dark and made a list. Not an angry list. I don't have loud in me, even alone with the lights off. A level list. The kind you balance down to the penny before you ever act on it. Tomorrow, I would go back to the shop and start clearing it, the way Cole expected. The dutiful sister, tidying up her worthless inheritance like a good girl. And while I cleared it, I was going to do the one thing my whole family had never once given me credit for. I was going to read what was actually written there, in the ledgers, in the dates. In a bead of welded steel, my father, who never once told me I was wrong about a weld, had left behind for exactly one person to find. The shop was cold when I let myself back in at 6 the next morning. That particular February cold that lives inside a metal building and doesn't leave again until July, no matter what the thermometer outside says. I made coffee in the percolator Dad kept on the parts shelf, the one that had been brewing bad coffee since sometime in the Carter administration. Then I started the way I always start a job too big to look at all at once. I picked a corner. You don't eat a whole hog in one sitting. You eat the part directly in front of you. The corner I picked was the file cabinet by the office door. A 4-drawer steel case the color of old mustard. I opened the bottom drawer first because that was always where my father kept the things he didn't want a walk-in customer wandering past and noticing. Ledgers, green canvas-bound books, 1 to a year, stretching back further than I'd been alive. Earl Garrity never once trusted a computer with a number. I'll tell you a secret. Neither do I. A computer lets you quietly change last Tuesday and never leave a mark. A pen can't do that. A pen remembers everything, whether you want it to or not. I pulled the last 3 years' worth and carried them to the bench. Shoved a coffee can of cotter pins out of the way to make room. Sat down on the stool that still had the dent worn into it from my father's hip. I started reading my father's handwriting like it was scripture. In that shop, it kind of was. I want you to understand what reading one of those ledgers is like for me. It isn't math, not really, not underneath. The math is only the surface. Under the math is an entire life. I could see the exact week the Hendersons' boy totaled the family cutlass. 3 quiet weeks of nothing entered. Then a clutch job and an alignment, and a whole list of small mercies billed at half of what they should have cost. I could see the summer the air handler in the shop finally died because the electric line doubled overnight and my father's own draw shrank to almost nothing, so his 2 mechanics could keep getting paid. That ledger was my father, in his own cramped hand, telling me exactly who he'd always been. Generous to people who couldn't always pay him back. Hard on himself first. A man who'd eat a loss quietly before he'd send a bill to somebody who genuinely couldn't cover it. I stopped once, around 8, when a regular named Sue Ann Fowler pulled in with a check engine light and a toddler asleep in the back seat. I dropped the ledger and read her code off the scanner myself. An oxygen sensor. $31 in parts, $40 in labor. I told her straight instead of padding it, because that's the other thing my father taught me alongside how to read a weld. You charge a fair number, and you say it plain, and you let the fair number be the whole argument. She paid. Thanked me twice. Said Earl would be proud watching me keep the doors open already. I said thank you. I didn't tell her I'd spent the hour before she pulled in hunting for a debt in her old friend's private numbers, afraid to actually find it. Then I went back to the ledger. 3 pages into the second book, I found the line that didn't belong. It sat in the spring, 2 years back. A debit entered in the loans out column. That column almost never had anything written in it, because Earl Garrity did not lend money on principle, having watched it ruin 2 friendships and a marriage over his life. But there it was, plain as anything, $40,000. Beside it, in his own cramped hand, 2 initials, C.G. Cole Garrity. I sat with that number a long minute. $40,000 isn't help with a flat tire. It isn't a favor between a father and a struggling kid. It's a number with real weight behind it. The kind that changes the shape of a family's whole financial life if it isn't paid back. I kept turning pages. I found a second entry. The following fall, $60,000. CG again. Same tight handwriting. No note explaining what it was for. Then, the spring after that, a bigger one still. $120,000. Beside that entry, my father had pressed the pen down so hard it had nearly torn through the page. He'd written one word beside it, a word I had genuinely never once heard him say out loud. He'd written enough. I added the four figures in my head. I can do that faster than most people manage on a phone because I've been adding Garrity numbers since I was 8 years old. Then I added them again on the back of a work order, just to be sure. Getting level instead of getting loud means you always check your own math twice. You never let anger do the arithmetic for you. 4 lines, roughly 2 years, $340,000 total, flowing out of a small town auto shop that cleared maybe 90,000 in a genuinely good year. Straight into Garrity Custom up in Indianapolis, into my brother's chrome fixtures and his tempered glass, and a showroom floor polished so bright you could eat a meal off it. $340,000. My brother had stood in our mother's kitchen 4 days earlier. He'd drawn a ruler straight line down a legal pad and split 600,000 into 2 even columns, like the money had simply appeared out of thin air, like our father had died holding a winning lottery ticket. The whole time, his own math had a hole in it the exact size of a second mortgage he'd never once had to sign for himself because he'd talked our father into carrying the debt for him instead. And the man who dug that hole was the same man sitting there holding the ruler and calling it fair. I closed the ledger carefully. I did not throw it. I want that on the record because there's a version of this story where I do, and that's not what happened. I set it down square on the bench, the way I set everything down. I walked out into the bay with my coffee going cold in my hand. I looked at the welded toolbox at the far end of the bench, and I said, out loud, to an empty shop and a dead man who couldn't hear me, "All right, Dad. All right. I'm starting to see you clearly now. Because here's the thing a ledger can't do on its own. A ledger can show you the money that left the building. It can't show you what that money actually was in the eyes of the law, or a family, or a courtroom if it ever came to that. My brother could stand up in any room in Tipton and call those 4 lines gifts. A father helping his struggling son. Tragic, maybe, but perfectly legal, and gone now, and none of anybody's business once the man who wrote the checks was already in the ground. A debit line in a dead man's private notebook is a story, and stories can always be argued down to nothing by a confident enough liar. I needed the other half. I needed the half where Cole himself had agreed, on paper, that it was a loan and not a gift. I needed something with my brother's own hand on it. Cole Garrity had spent his entire adult life learning one very useful lesson. If you talk fast enough and smile wide enough, people mostly forget to make you sign anything at all. I had a feeling I already knew exactly where that paper was sitting. I just wasn't ready yet to cut my way to it. I was still sitting with the ledger open when the bell over the front door jingled. A man I'd known my whole life let himself in without knocking, the way regulars at that shop had done for 40 years. Grady Pruitt, 60-some years old, drove a produce route 2 counties over, had been bringing his own truck and half his neighbor's trucks to Garrity Auto since before I was born. "Saw your truck out front," Grady said, pulling off his cap. "Wanted to say I'm sorry about Earl." He fixed my clutch on credit in '94 when I didn't have 2 nickels. You know that. I didn't know that particular one, I said, but it sounds about right. Grady's eyes went to the open ledger on the bench, then to my face. Careful, the way a man gets careful when he senses he's walked into something. "You doing the books already?" "Barely a day in the ground. Trying to understand something," I said. Before I could stop myself, because Grady had known my father longer than I'd been alive, I turned the ledger to face him and showed him the line. $40,000. CG. Does that mean anything to you, Grady? Cole ever say anything to you about needing money? Grady was quiet a second, turning his cap in his hands. I'm not one to carry tales, he said. But I'll tell you what I saw with my own eyes, since you're asking and not me offering. He set the cap down on the bench. 2 years back, maybe better, I was out front pumping air in my tires. Cole pulled in that big lifted truck of his, agitated. Earl came out to meet him before Cole even got the door shut, like he already knew what was coming. They stood right there by the pumps, and I heard your father say, plain as anything, "This is the last time I do this without you signing something, Cole. I'm not doing this on a handshake anymore." Cole said, "Fine, whatever, Dad, just help me out here." They went inside together. Grady picked his cap back up. I always figured that was between a father and a son. Wasn't my business to ask more. It's my business now, I said, quiet. I figured that too, the way you're looking at that book. Grady nodded toward the toolbox. Your dad ever tell you why he sealed that thing shut? Man asked me to help him move it once. Wouldn't say what was in it. Just laughed and said some things are safer welded than locked. I always thought that was an odd thing to say about a toolbox. I'm starting to understand it, I said. He didn't push past that. Grady Pruitt is the kind of man who knows exactly how far a neighbor is allowed to lean into somebody else's grief. He set his cap back on and told me to call if I needed anything hauled or lifted. He let himself back out, and the bell jingled again behind him. But before he left, he stopped in the doorway, like he'd forgotten something, and then remembered it. Whatever you find in that box, Tessa, your daddy was the most careful man I ever knew with a torch in his hand. He didn't weld a seam by accident. Whatever's under that lid, he put it there on purpose, for somebody particular. He tipped his cap. Smart money says that somebody's you. I sat with that a long while after he'd gone. Grady had just done something without knowing it. Something that would matter more than he could have guessed, standing there with his cap in his hands. He'd put a date and a witnessed conversation behind the very first line in that ledger. A living person's own memory of my father saying the words, "This is the last time I do this without you signing something," out loud at the gas pumps, in front of a man with no earthly reason to lie about it. That wasn't proof by itself, but it was corroboration. And corroboration is the kind of thing that turns a daughter's suspicion into something a lawyer can actually use. So I did the level thing next. I called Walt Hendricks. Walt had been my father's lawyer for going on 30 years. His friend for even longer than that. A wide, slow-moving man who kept his reading glasses on a beaded chain and had a habit of letting silence run in a room until the other person finally broke and filled it. His office sat above the hardware store on the square, up a flight of stairs that creaked the same note on the same board every single time. When I walked in that afternoon, he was already standing behind his desk, like he'd been expecting me. I'd come to understand he genuinely had. "Tessa," he said, setting his glasses down on the blotter. "I wondered which one of you three would end up being the one to walk through that door." "What does that mean, Walt? Sit down first." I sat. He crossed to a filing cabinet that needed an actual key, not the kind of drawer anybody could just pull open. He came back with a folder thick enough that I noticed it right away. My father's name written across the tab in Walt's own careful hand. A date stamped over a year old. Long before the hospital. Long before any of us had once imagined we'd be burying anybody that spring. "Your father came to see me about 14 months back," Walt said, easing himself down into his chair. "He'd had a scare with his heart. Didn't tell any of you kids about it. Didn't want the fuss," he said. "He sat right there in that chair you're sitting in now. And he told me, Walt, I need to fix something before it goes and fixes itself the hard way. Said he'd been giving Cole money for a while. Said he'd been telling himself it was help, plain and simple. Said he'd stopped being able to say that with a straight face, on account of the asks kept getting bigger every time, and the thank yous kept getting shorter. Walt took his glasses off, put them back on, a man fidgeting with the one object he had within reach. He said, "My boy is drowning in something up in that city, and every time he grabs my arm to stay above the water, one of these days he's going to pull me under with him. Or worse, pull this whole family under once I'm not here to hold the line." I could taste that shop coffee even sitting 3 blocks away in Walt's office. "Rennick," I said. Walt's eyebrows went up half an inch. For a man that's still, that amounted to a shout. "You already know that name." Cole said it twice at the kitchen table and couldn't decide which word to use for it. Buyer. Lender. I leaned forward in the chair. "What exactly is it, Walt?" "Rennick Capital Partners, out of Indianapolis. They make loans to businesses that can't get approved through an actual bank, at terms no honest bank would ever be allowed to write." He said the name the way you'd describe a slow illness. "Your brother took a balloon note from them a few years back to build out that showroom of his. You keep books, Tessa, so you know what a balloon note is. You pay a handful of little nothings for a few years running, and then one single day the entire sky comes down on you all at once. Cole's whole sky is due to land sometime this spring. That is what all that money leaving your father's shop actually was. Your brother was bailing out a sinking boat with your father's own 2 hands. The boat was never once going to stop taking on water because the hole in the hull has a name. That name is Rennick." I sat very still. The separate pieces of it were turning slowly to face the same direction, the way pieces always eventually do. Slow, then all at once. "The house," I said. "Cole's rushing to sell the house. To a buyer whose own financing runs straight through Rennick." I looked at Walt across the desk. "He isn't selling our father's house to some stranger. He's handing it to his own lender, just to buy himself a few more weeks before that balloon note eats him whole." "That," Walt said quietly, "is exactly the part I have not yet been able to prove on paper. The estate filing your brother brought me doesn't reconcile with the split he's out there claiming to everyone. There's a lien flagged against the Delphi Pike property nobody has bothered to explain to me. And the figures Cole handed me simply do not match the figures I already know your father actually had in the bank." He spread both hands flat on the desk. "I am the attorney of record on the real will, Tessa. The one your father signed right here, with 2 witnesses present, 14 months ago. Not whatever your brother has been waving around at that kitchen table like it settles anything. In that real will, your father left very specific instructions for how this estate gets settled. Plus one sealed component he told me plainly I would find only when the time came. He said I was under no circumstances to go hunting for it myself, that the right person would eventually walk it in through my door." He looked at me over the top of his glasses. He told me, "Walt, when my daughter Tessa walks through that door already knowing what she knows, that's the moment. Not one day sooner." The stairs creaked once behind me, even though nobody was standing on them. Just the whole building settling in the February cold. I thought about my father standing at his workbench, one hand flat against a gray steel lid, telling me everything I built is in that shop. Me handing him a wrench, quietly deciding he was only getting sentimental in his old age. He hadn't been sentimental for 1 second. He'd been telling me exactly where to look. He'd been telling me for the better part of a year, every single time I was too busy or too tired or too certain I already understood my own father completely to stop and listen. "Walt," I said, "what's inside the box?" "I genuinely do not know," he said, and I believed every word of it. because in 31 years, I have never once caught Walt Hendricks in a lie. He never told me what was in it. He only ever told me where it was, and who would find it, and roughly when. The what, he left entirely up to you. Walt opened the thick folder and turned one page and read it back to me slow, in something close to my father's own voice. The way you read out loud the words of somebody you already miss with your whole chest. He said, and I wrote this down at the time because it made no sense to me at all. He said, Tessa will know it's real, because Tessa can read my hand better than I can read it myself. Tell her to read the seam first. Read the seam first. For one long second, I honestly could not breathe right. Because that was it. That was the entire thing my father had been doing when he ran that slow, careful bead around the lid of his own toolbox, years before either of us knew what was coming. He hadn't been hiding something from us. Anybody with a shovel can hide something. A hidden object can be found by accident and slid quietly off a bench into a brother's duffel bag before probate ever gets its eyes open. My father had done something a great deal smarter than that, and sadder, and 100 times more like the man he'd always been. He had made the proof physically impossible to move and impossible to fake. Then he'd signed the whole thing the one way it could never be forged. In a private language only one of his 3 children had ever bothered learning by heart. He had welded it shut, so the only way in was through the weld itself. The only person on this earth who could be trusted on the far side of that seam was the one who could read the start of his own bead with her thumb held over it and point, every single time, straight to the spot. He had locked his last words inside the one safe on earth that only ever opened for me. Walt, I said. Why didn't he just tell me himself? Why all this? The weld, the note, waiting for you to hand me a sentence a year after he sat in that chair. Walt considered that a long moment, unhurried, the way he considers everything. Because your father was not a man who liked to make his children feel managed, he said finally. If he'd sat you down and told you all this to your face, some part of you would have spent the rest of your life wondering why. Wondering if he'd only said it because he was scared, or dying, or trying to buy your loyalty against your own brother. This way, you found it yourself. Nobody handed it to you. You earned every bit of it with your own 2 hands. The same way you've earned everything else in that shop for 9 years. He knew that would matter to you more than the money ever could. Walt slid his glasses off one more time. Your father was not a subtle man about a torque spec, Tessa. He was a very subtle man about people. I watched him be that way for 30 years, and I still don't know how he did both at once. I need to get to the shop, I said, already standing, and my voice did not shake. I don't get loud. I get level. I had never once in my whole life needed to be more level than I was about to need to be that evening. Walt stood too. He carried the thick folder back over to the cabinet that needed a key, and turned that key, and looked at me a long moment with something on his face I would only understand fully later. Tessa, he said, whatever ends up being inside that box, your father didn't seal it up to hurt anybody left standing. He sealed it shut because he loved every one of his 3 children, and he could only ever protect the one who stayed close enough to hear him. He paused, glasses back in his hand. Bring it here to me the second you have it. Don't you dare open it in front of your brother. Open it somewhere safe. Then bring me whatever is inside, and let me handle the rest of it in a room with rules. A room with rules. I carried those 3 words the entire drive back across town, past the empty courthouse square, past the grain elevator standing up against the gray sky, down Ash Street to the shop with my father's name still on the sign, where a torch sat waiting on a clean bench and a seam of steel sat waiting to finally be read. The drive only takes 9 minutes. I've made it easily 10,000 times in my life. That particular evening, I felt every seam in the road through the old truck's tired springs, every patch spot where the county had filled a frost heave years back and never once returned to do the job right. Tipton at 6 in the evening in February is a town with its collar turned all the way up. The square sat empty. The Christmas lights nobody had gotten around to taking down were still burning in the bare trees outside the courthouse, red and gold against the dark. The diner on the corner had two cars out front and a hand-lettered sign about the Friday fish fry. The grain elevator stood against the last thin light of the day, like the only tall thing for 20 miles in any direction. Out there, it genuinely is. I drove the length of Ash Street with the heater ticking. I didn't turn on the radio. I wanted to hear my own thoughts clearly, and what I kept thinking over and over in my father's own flat voice was one single sentence: read the seam first. I parked behind the shop the way I always park, nose pointed out. I let myself in through the side door with the key that had never once left my ring in 9 years. The key my brother had never bothered asking me for, because it had genuinely never once occurred to Cole that the lock on that building might be worth more than the building itself. The fluorescents stuttered to life bank by bank, the way they always do. Hard, flat white shop light across the bays, across the lift, across the parts shelf with the tired old percolator, all the way down to the bench at the far end where the toolbox sat exactly as it always had. Gray, squat, a four-drawer rolling chest that had stopped rolling anywhere years ago because my father had set it down permanently on the bench top and run a single bead of steel all the way around the lid, sealing the top drawer shut for good, turning an ordinary toolbox into a strongbox in the space of maybe 40 minutes one quiet afternoon, while I'd been too busy buttoning up somebody's transmission to look up and ask him why. I walked up to it the way you approach a sleeping animal you respect. I put my hand flat against the lid the way he used to. The steel was cold enough to actually ache under my palm. Then I did exactly what he had told Walt all those months ago to eventually tell me to do. I crouched down with the drop light in one hand, and I read the seam. You have to understand what a weld actually is if you're a person who can read one. It is a signature. I don't mean that the soft, poetic way people usually mean it. I mean it completely literally. The way a man strikes his arc, the way he carries his puddle across the joint, the small hitch he makes whenever he has to stop and restart because his hand cramped up or his rod ran short, the exact spacing of the ripple left behind. All of it is as personal as the loops in a person's own signature. I had watched my father weld steel since before I was tall enough to see over the bench without standing on a bucket. I would know his bead in a junkyard full of 1,000 other beads. This one, this slow and careful seam sealing the lid of his own toolbox, was the most purely him thing I believe I have ever laid eyes on. He had started at the front left corner, the way he always started everything in that shop. You could clearly see where he'd paused at each of the four corners to reposition his whole body. Four separate little tie-ins nested inside the one long continuous seam. He had not rushed a single inch of it. My father never once rushed anything that genuinely mattered to him. He had laid that bead down clean and even and permanent. He had known with absolute certainty that the only living person who would ever crouch here and read it was me. The only one who'd be completely sure it was his own hand and not some stranger's clumsy forgery. A hidden object can be stolen from you in an afternoon. A welded object has to be cut open, and a cut always leaves a mark behind, and a mark can be testified to under oath in front of a judge. My father had not hidden his last words from anyone. He had gone ahead and notarized them, permanently, in raw steel. I took the plasma cutter down off the wall. I could have used a grinder instead. It would have run quieter, and the nearest neighbor sits a good quarter-mile off anyway. But a grinder eats the metal down and throws the evidence away as fine gray dust. Some part of me, the careful part, the same part that balances books to the exact penny every month, wanted to cut this precisely along the line my father himself had drawn, so that anybody who ever doubted my word later could lay that lid back down flush against the box and see with their own eyes that I had opened it only at the seam and nowhere else on the steel. I clamped the ground lead to the bench, checked the air pressure twice, pulled on the jacket that still smelled faintly of him, cigarette smoke and 3-in-1 oil, and the particular sweetness of the hand cream he used every winter because the shop dried his knuckles clean to splitting. I pulled the hood down over my eyes, and I lit the torch. Sparks came off the cut in a hard, bright fan, that white gold rooster tail that pools across the concrete floor and skitters and finally dies out. The whole building filled up with that ripping hiss of a plasma arc doing its work. The cut line ran molten and then parted clean. I followed my father's original bead around 3 full corners, with my hands as steady as they have ever once been in my life. I don't get loud, I get level. There is no single place on this whole earth where I have ever felt more level than standing behind a torch with a job that has to be done exactly right. At the 4th and final corner, I shut the torch off completely. The silence rushed back into the shop all at once, the way still water closes back over a dropped stone. My ears were ringing. The drop light swung gently on its cord where I'd knocked it earlier, throwing shadows back and forth across the bench. There was one thin gray thread of smoke climbing straight up off the freshly cut steel into the cold shop air. The lid itself, when I finally touched it with the back of my glove and felt it give way under my hand, lifted. I raised it slowly. There was a shallow tray fitted inside, the kind every steel chest like that one always has built into the top. My father had lined the whole tray with a shop rag folded neatly into quarters, the same blue rags he bought by the case. Resting on top of that rag, dry and squared off, set down exactly the deliberate way he set down everything he ever touched, sat a bundle wrapped tight in a gallon freezer bag against the damp. Through the clear plastic, I could make out the top sheet immediately. The top sheet was a will, not a photocopy. The real thing, blue backer and all. The twin of the very document Walt had described sitting in his own office, signed and properly witnessed 14 months earlier. Tucked in directly behind it, I could just make out the corner of something else entirely. A single typed page, with handwriting added at the bottom in ink. Behind that, one smaller thing folded once. A sheet of the same yellow legal pad paper my father kept sitting by the kitchen phone his whole life. Writing on it in pencil, smudged slightly along the fold, the way pencil always eventually does. I did not snatch any of it up right away. I would love to tell you I did. That I tore straight into that bag, the way you'd probably imagine any person would in that exact moment. I didn't. I stood there over my own father's open box in the ringing quiet of that shop, and I let myself feel, for the length of maybe one long-held breath, the entire size of what he had actually done. He had known. At some point in the final year of his life, sitting right there at that kitchen table with his bad heart and his green canvas ledgers, my father had looked clear-eyed at his own 3 grown children. He had understood, completely, exactly how each of them was going to behave the morning after they lowered him into the ground. He had known Cole would arrive fast and smiling with a legal pad already in hand. He had known Dana would let herself be talked gently into whatever cost her the very least. And he had known that I would stay, because I always stayed, and that staying would be read by the other two exactly the way it had always been read by them. As proof, I was simply the one who couldn't do any better for herself. The daughter you hand the junk to on your way out the door. He had built his entire last act around one single certainty. The only one of his 3 children who would ever walk into this shop and genuinely read his bead with her thumb pressed over the start of it was the daughter the other two had already quietly written off years earlier. He had not sealed me out of anything. He had sealed the truth inside, in the one place only I could ever reach it. I was the only one of his children he could trust to carry it straight into a room with rules, without once cashing it in for herself along the way. I picked the freezer bag up with both hands. Careful, the way you'd lift something alive. I peeled it open under the good light at the bench and laid the 3 items out side by side on a clean shop rag, the exact way my father would have laid out the parts of a stripped-down carburetor, in careful order so that any person could put the whole thing back together later and miss absolutely nothing. The will, the typed page, the pencil note. I read them in the exact order he had stacked them, because I understood now, with total certainty, that the order itself was intentional. My father never once did anything in a pile purely by accident. The will I mostly already knew, thanks to Walt. It left the shop, the building, and the land it sat on to me outright, entirely free of the estate, in language plain enough that even Cole's lawyer couldn't bend it sideways. It left the house on Delphi Pike, and every cash account to be divided among the 3 of us in equal thirds. That happened to be precisely the part Cole had been so careful to skip past with his legal pad and his 2 clean columns. A full third for me was a full third my brother had never once budgeted himself to lose. Then, near the very bottom, sat one paragraph. Walt had already told me it existed, but I needed to see it written in my father's own signed hand before I could truly believe it. It stated plainly that any sums advanced by Earl Garrity to any heir during his lifetime, and documented as such, were to be treated strictly as advances against that heir's eventual share, deducted, dollar for dollar, before any final division was made, documented as such. My own father had built a hinge directly into his own will, and left the door standing open for a second page to swing through it. The second page was that door. It was typed cleanly on plain paper. Across the top it read, "Acknowledgement of advance." Underneath, in dry and careful legal sentences, it laid the whole arrangement out in black and white, that the undersigned Cole Garrity acknowledged having received from his father, Earl Garrity, the total sum of $340,000, delivered across 4 separate advances on 4 specific dates, dates that matched, day for day, the 4 lines I had already read that same morning in the green ledger, that the sum in question was an advance, and explicitly not a gift, that the undersigned agreed it would be set squarely against his own eventual share of the estate. Down at the very bottom, on the signature line, in that loose, confident slash, I had watched my own brother scrawl across the bottoms of birthday cards and shop invoices, and one borrowed truck title for our entire lives sat Cole's own name, his own hand, properly witnessed, dated 14 months and change earlier, in Walt Hendricks's own office. On a day I now understood my brother had walked into believing he was simply signing one more small piece of paperwork to unlock one more advance, smiling the entire time, never once actually reading the words sitting directly above the signature line. Cole Garrity had spent 37 years of his life learning, over and over, that nobody ever once made him stop and read before he signed his own name to something. My own father had made him read it. He had simply never once told him so out loud. I sat down hard on the stool with the worn dent in it. I put one hand flat over my own mouth. Not because I was about to cry. I wasn't. But because the entire shape of the plan had just come completely clear all at once. It was so exactly, so completely, so perfectly my father that it briefly took the air straight out of my chest. He had let Cole believe he was simply a soft touch. He had let Cole believe the asking was actually working on him. Every single time my brother had reached out and grabbed his arm to stay above the waterline, my father had quietly reached down, pulled him back up, and gently, patiently, secured one more signature on one more page, building the exact case against the day he would no longer be here to argue it out loud himself. He had let his own son walk around believing he was winning. The entire time he was silently teaching me, in raw steel and dried ink and careful ledger columns, precisely how to set the whole thing right after he was gone. The third item, the pencil note written on the yellow legal pad paper, I read last. I read it twice through. Then I folded it back along its own single soft crease and slid it into the inside pocket of the jacket that still smelled like him, against my own chest, where it stayed, because that particular page was mine alone and not for any room with rules. I will tell you exactly what it said before this story is finished. Not yet. I still had a torch to put away and a lid to set back down square against its own freshly cut seam, and one phone call left to make to a wide, slow man sitting above a hardware store. After all of that, I still had to do the single hardest level thing of my entire life so far, which was simply to wait. I sat in the shop a while longer that night before I called Walt, the freezer bag squared away on the bench in front of me. I let myself think, for just a minute, about the version of this where I hadn't stayed. There was a version of my life where I'd left Tipton at 22 the way Cole had. Chased something bigger in a bigger city. In that version, nobody would have been standing in this shop the night my father's last words needed reading. The Weld would have sat there another 5 years, maybe 10, until somebody sold the building out of the estate to a stranger who'd have cut it open with a grinder out of simple curiosity and thrown the whole of it away as scrap without understanding what they were holding. My father hadn't just left the truth in a box. He'd bet his entire last plan on the daughter who stayed being the same daughter who would still be standing there to read it. I don't know if that was fair to ask of anybody. I only know he was right to ask it of me. Being right about a person you raised is its own kind of quiet miracle. My father never got to see it land before he died. I got to carry it for him instead. Because the estate signing was already set for that coming Thursday. Cole had scheduled it himself, in a conference room out at the title company on the bypass. In a rush, the same way he did absolutely everything that entire spring, because the house sale was supposed to close on the very same afternoon, and the buyer's financing ran straight through a lender named Rennick. My brother badly needed the one deal to feed the other before the whole sky he'd spent years quietly borrowing against finally came crashing down on top of his head. He'd told me the exact time as an afterthought over the phone, the same way you'd casually mention a schedule to the cleaning lady. Thursday, 10 o'clock sharp. Bring the garage key in case the buyer wants a look. Shouldn't take long at all. It would take exactly as long as it needed to take. I set the lid back down square. I checked the seam with my own eye, running it slow, corner to corner. You always check. Every single time. In the days leading up to Thursday, I kept clearing the shop the way Cole expected. Boxing up old parts catalogs, sweeping down the rafters, making myself visible in town doing exactly the small, dutiful thing my family had already decided I was built for. I did that on purpose. A woman quietly boxing up a worthless garage draws no attention at all. No attention was exactly what I needed while Walt worked behind the scenes filing the paperwork that would matter come Thursday morning. I drove the will and the typed acknowledgement over to Walt's office the very next afternoon, the freezer bag riding on the truck seat beside me like a passenger. I watched him read the acknowledgement of advance through the bottom half of his reading glasses, twice, without saying a single word either time. Then he took the glasses off entirely and rubbed the two red marks they always left on the sides of his nose, and he said one word, Earl. Just that. Just my father's own name, spoken the exact way you say it when a man you've known and trusted for 30 straight years reaches all the way back from wherever he's gone and sets one final thing precisely where it always needed to be. He documented 4 advances, Walt said, laying the page flat on his desk blotter. 40,000, 60,000, 120,000, and one more I hadn't seen yet. He turned to the ledger photocopy I'd brought and tapped a 4th line near the bottom of the second book, one I'd somehow skimmed past in my own reading that first morning. 120,000 more, dated 4 months before he passed. That's your father's full total. $460,000, Tessa. Not 340. He kept helping right up until the very end, and he kept making your brother sign for every single dollar of it. $460,000. I sat with that new number a long moment. It changed the whole shape of Thursday's arithmetic. It told me something about my father I hadn't fully understood yet. His patience with Cole had run even deeper and even sadder than I had first believed. He told me something else, back when he first came to see me, Walt went on, sliding his glasses back on. He said if Cole ever managed to pay any of it back on his own, out of pure decency, he wanted the will to forgive whatever he owed, wanted an actual clause for it. I told him I'd never once drafted a clause quite like it. Forgiveness contingent on repentance, essentially. But I wrote it anyway, because it was his money and his son and his call to make. Walt found the paragraph and turned the will to face me. It's here. If Cole repays any portion of the advance voluntarily, before the estate closes, that portion is forgiven and restored to his share. Your father left him a door out, Tessa, right up to the very last minute. Whether your brother ever walks through it is entirely on him. I thought about that clause the whole drive home. My father hadn't built a trap. He'd built a mirror and left it standing exactly where Cole would eventually have to look into it. Walt made careful copies of everything I'd brought, had them certified, locked the originals away in the fireproof box he kept in the back room. He told me plainly to bring nothing at all to Thursday's signing except myself and the garage key Cole had already asked me to bring, and to let my brother talk for exactly as long as my brother wanted to talk. A room with rules, he said again, sliding the folder away into the dark of that locked cabinet. You let me run it. You don't get loud. You already told me yourself that's simply not how you go. The Sunday before the signing, Dana asked me to come to dinner at Cole's rental house on the edge of town, said it was time the 3 of us sat down like a family before everything got settled and lawyered up. I almost said no. Then I thought about the freezer bag sitting in Walt's fireproof box and decided there was something useful in sitting across a table from my brother while he still believed he had the whole thing won. Cole grilled steaks he clearly couldn't afford anymore and poured wine he definitely couldn't afford. He talked the entire meal about Garrity Custom's spring lineup, a new bay he was planning to add, a franchise idea he'd been kicking around with a buddy from Indianapolis. Easy and confident. A man building a future out loud in front of 2 women he had no idea were already holding the paperwork that ended it. I asked him, gentle as I could manage, how the shop up there was really doing. financing-wise, whether the bank had been good to him. Better than good, Cole said, refilling his own glass. Rennick's been solid. Long as I make my numbers this spring, we're golden. He said it easy, no hitch at all. The same confident voice he'd used my whole life to talk his way past questions he didn't want asked twice. What happens if you don't make your numbers? I said. Still gentle, still just a sister asking after her brother's business. Something flickered behind his eyes. There and gone so fast I might have missed it, if I hadn't spent 31 years reading this exact face across this exact kind of table. I will, he said. I've got it handled. He raised his glass a little toward me, almost fond. You worry too much, Tess. Always have. Some of us know how to make money work for us instead of just keeping score of it. I smiled and let it go. Asked Dana to pass the potatoes. Underneath the table where nobody could see it, my hands stayed perfectly still because I already knew exactly how badly he did not have it handled. Some part of me understood, watching him pour a third glass of wine he'd need every dollar of to cover a note coming due in weeks. This was the final easy dinner my brother was ever going to eat, believing his own story about himself. I didn't say a word that would have taken that from him early. He'd find out soon enough, in a room with rules, from a man who wasn't his sister and couldn't be accused of setting a trap out of spite. 2 days before the signing, on the Tuesday, my sister Dana showed up at the shop unannounced, standing in the bay doorway in her good coat, arms crossed against the cold, looking at me like she wasn't sure whether she'd come to apologize or to fish. Cole says you're being difficult about Thursday, she said. Says you're bringing some lawyer thing to the closing. I'm bringing the truth, I said, wiping my hands on a rag. Walt's bringing the paperwork. She was quiet a second, arms still crossed, looking past me at the toolbox on the bench, the seam cut clean and the lid set back square. Is that it? She said. The box Dad welded shut. That's it. What's in it? I looked at my sister a long moment. 29 years old, good coat, rental car, a woman who had spent her whole adult life choosing whichever version of events cost her the least to believe. Come Thursday and find out, I said. Not unkind. I'm not doing this twice, Dana. Once, in front of Walt, in a room with rules. That's the only way it's fair to everybody, including you. She left without another word, but she didn't slam the door. I noticed that because my sister has spent her whole life slamming doors when she's really just embarrassed. This time she pulled it shut soft, like a woman who already suspected what was coming and didn't want to hear it land twice. Wednesday morning, one day before the signing, Walt called me at the shop. Something in his voice was different from anything I'd heard out of him yet. A little faster than his usual unhurried drawl. Walt Hendricks does not hurry for nothing. I need you to come by, he said. I found something in the recorder's office this morning I wasn't looking for. I drove over with grease still under 2 of my fingernails. Walt had a county document spread flat on his desk when I walked in. A certified copy, the seal still crisp on it. He turned it to face me before I'd even sat all the way down. There's a second lien on the Delphi Pike house, he said. Filed 8 months ago. Not Rennick. A different name. He tapped the page. Marlene Doss. I didn't know the name. I said so. I didn't either, at first, Walt said. So I called around this morning. Quiet. The way you learn to in this business. Marlene Doss is Cole's ex-wife's mother. Cole borrowed against the house itself. Tessa, not just against the shop. Used a signed authorization your father apparently gave him 2 years back for a much smaller, much narrower purpose. A temporary line to cover a slow season at the shop. Cole stretched that same authorization to cover a personal debt to his former mother-in-law. $110,000, without ever telling your father the second loan existed at all. I sat down slow. Dad didn't know. Your father knew about the shop advances because Cole came asking, every time, hand out, and Earl made him sign for it, Walt said. This one he never asked permission for. He just used the paper he already had in hand and stretched it somewhere your father never authorized it to go. Walt took his glasses off, which means, legally, it's a separate problem from the will, and a worse one. It's not an advance against an inheritance. It's a debt secured against a house that isn't even in the estate's clear title yet. If it isn't resolved before tomorrow, the house closing doesn't just push back a week. It doesn't close at all. Not to anybody. Not until a judge sorts out whose lien has priority. I thought about Cole standing at that kitchen table with his ruler, telling me the house lists Monday, so certain of his own math. He'd forgotten there was a second column of debt out there with his name on it, one nobody else in the family had ever been shown. Does he know you found this? Not yet, Walt said, and I'd like to keep it that way until tomorrow morning, if you're willing. Let him walk into that room believing the only thing waiting for him is the advance. The lien is worse, and it's real, and it stands on its own whether we say a word about it or not. But if we hold it back and let the advance land first, we get to watch exactly how deep the hole actually goes. In his own words, in front of witnesses, instead of him having all night to build a story around it. I sat with that a long moment. Some part of me, the tired part, wanted to just hand Walt everything I knew and let him carry the whole weight of it into that room alone. But my father hadn't welded that box shut and written that pencil note so that I could sit quiet in a truck the next morning while somebody else did the level thing on my behalf. Bring it, I said, both pages. Let it land the way it actually happened. In order. In order, Walt agreed and wrote something small in the margin of his own file. I drove back to the shop with one more piece of my brother's life sitting cold in my chest, a piece I hadn't asked for and couldn't hand back. Thursday came up gray and hard, the kind of February morning where the whole sky over Tipton sits down low across the fields, and the wind comes cutting straight across the bare bean stubble, with nothing standing in its way for 10 miles. I was up before 5 that morning. I went to the shop first, not straight to the title company, because I wanted to stand inside it one more time while it was still, technically, officially, nobody's at all. I made a full pot of coffee in that tired old percolator on the parts shelf and drank it sitting on the stool with the dent worn into it. The toolbox lid set back down square over its own freshly cut seam, positioned so that any man who genuinely understood steel could lay his eye along that line and tell you immediately it had been opened only at the seam. Nowhere else on that box. The freezer bag rode in my coat pocket. The yellow legal pad note rode in the inside pocket against my chest, exactly where it had ridden every day since the night I first lifted that lid. The title company sits out along the bypass between the farm co-op and a tax preparation office that's only open 3 months a year. A low brick building with worn blue carpet and one conference room built around a long fake wood table with a whiteboard on the wall nobody had ever once written on. I pulled into the lot at 10 minutes before 10. Cole's truck already sat there. The big lifted one with the wrap along the side reading Garrity Custom in Chrome script over a painted flame, parked crooked across 2 full spaces the exact way he always parks. Dana's little crossover sat parked beside it. I pulled in nose out at the far end of the lot, the way I always park, and I sat there behind the wheel 1 full second, with both hands resting flat against it. Level. Then I got out and walked inside. They were already seated at the table. Cole had claimed the head of it naturally, his leather folder open in front of him, 2 pens laid perfectly parallel, That same easy Sunday morning smile aimed straight at the closing agent, a tired, pleasant woman named Brenda Kessler, with a thick stack of tabbed documents and a notary stamp sitting ready by her elbow. Dana sat beside him in her good coat, half turned away, staring at her phone the exact way she stares at her phone whenever she's already decided not to be fully present for something she suspects she isn't going to like. A man I didn't recognize sat down at the far end in a quarter-zip sweater with a folder of his own. The moment I walked in, Cole waved a hand vaguely in the man's direction without properly introducing him. "That's the buyer's side. We're closing the house at the same time today. Saves everybody an extra trip." The man gave me one short, polite nod. I understood immediately that this was the other end of it. Our father's house going out the door in the exact same hour as the estate itself. One deal quietly feeding the other, precisely the way my father had already seen coming from a year and 2 months away. "Tessa," Cole said, big and warm, pulling out the empty chair beside himself like a proper host welcoming a guest. "Sit, sit. You bring the garage key? Buyer might want to swing by the shop later, take a quick look, no rush at all." He didn't wait for any kind of answer from me. He turned straight back to Brenda and tapped his neat stack of papers twice. "So we keep this simple today. House proceeds plus the accounts. That's the estate proper, split 3 even ways per the will. Brenda's got the full disbursement sheet ready to go. Shop and the dirt under it goes straight to Tess here. She's the actual gearhead in the family. Dad always wanted it that way. No argument out of me whatsoever." He spread both hands wide, generous, a man handing his little sister a gift in front of witnesses who could all confirm his generosity later. "Honestly, I think it's exactly right. She earned that wrench fair and square. Let's get everybody paid today and home well before lunch." I sat down. I set the garage key on the table directly in front of me, the same rusted key he'd slid across our mother's kitchen table the morning after we buried our father, telling me it was all I was ever going to be worth. I left it sitting there between the two of us, where he could see it clearly the whole time. "Before we sign off on any disbursement," I said, "there's one more document that needs to go into the estate file first." My voice came out exactly the way it always comes out under real pressure. Flat. Even. The same voice I use standing behind a torch. Walt Hendricks came through the conference room door at that exact moment. Not remotely an accident. I had told him 10 o'clock sharp, and in 30 years of practicing law in this county, Walt Hendricks has never once shown up late to a room he fully intended to run. He came in slow and wide and entirely unbothered in his gray suit, soft leather folder tucked under one arm, and he said, "Morning, all, pleasant as Sunday." He pulled out the chair at the very foot of the table, directly opposite Cole, and sat down. The whole temperature in that room shifted by roughly 1 full degree. The exact way a man's easy smile changes shape the moment a card he never dealt himself turns face up on the table in front of him. "Walt," Cole said, working to keep his voice light, "didn't realize you were planning on coming out today." "Earl asked me to," Walt said simply. He set his folder down on the table. He took his glasses out of his breast pocket and put them on, unhurried. He opened the folder and laid 2 separate pages face up, where the gray window light fell directly across them. Then he turned both pages so they faced Cole and Brenda equally. "Your father left a specific instruction attached to the will. It's part of the estate record now. Before any funds get disbursed today, it needs to be read formally into the file. I'll go ahead and do that now." "What instruction?" Cole said. The smile was still hanging on his face, but it had gone fixed and a little glassy. The exact way a smile goes fixed when the floor a man is standing on quietly makes a sound it has no business making. Walt didn't rush a single word of it. He read the relevant paragraph of the will first, the one buried near the bottom, in his flat, unhurried courtroom voice. The part about any sums advanced by Earl Garrity to any heir during his lifetime, and properly documented as such, being treated as advances against that heir's eventual share and deducted, dollar for dollar, before any final division of the estate. Then he set that page down gently and picked up the second one, the typed one, and read the heading out loud. Acknowledgement of advance. Then he read one full sentence from it. The undersigned Cole Garrity acknowledges receipt from Earl Garrity of the sum of $460,000, delivered in 4 separate advances, as an advance against his eventual share of the estate. Walt paused, and agrees that said sum shall be fully deducted from that share. He looked up over the top of his glasses. He turned the page the last necessary few degrees, so the signature line at the bottom faced my brother directly, and he said, "That is your signature, Cole. Properly witnessed. Dated 14 months ago, in my own office." The room went completely quiet. Dana set her phone face down on the table. Slow, careful, like it might go off. Brenda, the closing agent, froze with her pen hovering an inch above her stack and didn't move it another inch. The buyer's man in the quarter zip glanced from Cole to the page and back to Cole again. Cole laughed. It came out wrong, a half beat too late and a half tone too high to land as anything close to genuine. No. That was paperwork for a loan I already paid most of back. That's not. He pulled the page toward himself with 2 fingers and stared down at the signature. That same loose, confident slash of his own name he had scrawled across the bottoms of birthday cards and shop tickets our entire lives. I watched him actually read the words sitting directly above that line, I am certain, for the very first time. The exact words our father had made him sign but had never once told him to slow down and actually read. I watched my brother understand it. In front of his sister, his other sister, the woman holding the notary stamp, and the man who had come here today specifically to buy our father's house out from under all of us. He had signed every single word of it himself. "You took it across 4 separate years," Walt said gently, "because Walt Hendricks is never once cruel, even in the exact moment he is being completely final." Earl wrote down every date himself. The bank statements confirm every one of those dates. They match the ledger he kept religiously his entire life, to the letter. He never once hid a dollar of it from you, son. He simply had you put your own name to it each and every time. He was keeping the books straight, so nobody would ever have to fight over it once he was gone. Walt closed the folder with both hands. "It comes directly off your share now, Cole. 460,000 against a full third of roughly 600,000. The plain arithmetic doesn't leave you a check today. It leaves you owing the estate a genuine balance. I will tell you now, finally, what nobody sitting at that table knew except me. What I had carried against my own chest the entire week and had chosen not to say, because it was never meant for any room with rules. The third item in that steel box, the pencil note on the yellow legal pad, was 4 short lines in my father's own hand. It read, "Tess, you'll be the one who opens this, because you're the only one of mine who would ever bother reading my own weld. I'm not leaving you the shop because it's worth the least of anything I own. I'm leaving it to you because it's worth the most. And you're the only one of my children who already understands that plainly. Don't you ever let them tell you what you were worth. You kept my books straight to the penny for 9 years running, and you never once asked me for a single dime of your own. Dad." I had read those 4 lines standing alone in that shop under the drop light, and I had not cried then, and I did not cry now, sitting at that long fake wood table, watching my brother go pale in front of strangers. I simply felt that folded page sitting warm against my chest, while the rest of the room came slowly apart around him. Walt let that sit exactly as long as it needed to sit. Then he opened the folder one more time. "There's one more matter for the file," he said, and set the certified county copy down in the same spot where the other 2 pages had lain. A lien against the Delphi Pike property, filed 8 months ago. Marlene Doss. Cole's face did something I had never once seen it do in 31 years. It went blank, then gray, all in the space of a breath. "That's not," he started, and stopped. $110,000, Walt said. "Borrowed against an authorization your father gave you for the shop. Stretched to cover a personal debt to your ex-wife's mother, without your father's knowledge and without his signature anywhere on it." Walt looked at the buyer's man in the quarter zip. "Which means the title on that house was never clean to begin with, gentlemen, and wouldn't have been clean today no matter what happened with the estate. You'd have funded a sale this afternoon on a property carrying an undisclosed lien your own client's counsel never caught. I'd call that a fortunate morning for everyone at this table except one person in it." The buyer's man closed his own folder without another word and stood up, said something quiet to Brenda about rescheduling through his office, and let himself out. I understood, watching him go, that Cole had just lost the house sale twice in the space of 4 minutes. Once to his own signature, and once to a debt he'd never told a single person about. It was the name Rennick that finally took every last bit of air out of him. Before the buyer's man had even reached the door, Cole turned to him, half rising out of his chair, and said the house had to close today. It had to fund today. No exceptions. The man said evenly that his side had already heard there was a lien notice flagged on Cole's own commercial paper too. Something tied to a lender called Rennick. Until that particular lien cleared, his client wasn't remotely comfortable moving forward at all. Cole said Rennick had nothing whatsoever to do with the house. Rennick was strictly his shop's business, entirely separate. The second those words left his own mouth out loud in that quiet, blue-carpeted room, I watched him hear it himself for the very first time. Rennick was the balloon. Rennick was the note quietly coming due on Garrity Custom out in Indianapolis. That flashy showroom hollow clean to the studs behind its polished glass. The actual reason my brother had come racing home so fast and smiling with a legal pad the morning after our father's funeral. The actual reason he'd needed the estate to fund this exact week and not the next one. The actual reason he had handed me a rusted key and one cruel sentence and quietly counted on me to swallow it without a single word. He had grabbed for the cash because he was mere weeks from going under completely, and he had already spent every dollar of it in his own head weeks before it ever existed. Now there was no cash left for him at all, only a documented debt owed to the estate, and a deduction written in his own hand, and a probate hold that Walt said, mild as fresh milk, he intended to file that very same afternoon. Somewhere out along the bypass toward Indianapolis, a lender named Rennick was about to discover that the money my brother had promised against his own balloon note was never actually going to arrive. Cole stood straight up out of his chair. Too fast. The chair rolled backward hard enough to bang against the wall behind him. He looked all around that conference table for somebody, anybody, willing to be on his side. Dana wouldn't meet his eyes at all. Brenda had suddenly become extremely occupied with squaring the edges of her own stack. Walt simply sat there, wide and calm, hands folded neatly over his closed folder, like a man with the entire rest of the day free and clear. Cole looked at me last of everyone in that room. "You did this," he said, low and tight. "You set this whole thing up." "No," I said. I picked the rusted garage key back up off the table and slid it into my own coat pocket, because it was genuinely mine now. The lock and the building and the dirt underneath it, free and clear, deeded to me outright well before any of this mourning had happened, and completely untouchable by any hold Walt was about to file. Dad did this, years ago, patient as anything. I only read the weld. I stood up too, level the whole way, because level is simply how I stay upright. I don't get loud, Cole. I get level, and the level never once lies to anybody. I drove back across town afterward with the truck's heater ticking steadily. The winter fields slid by gray on either side. The grain elevator stood at the far end of Ash Street exactly the way it has always stood. But the story, and my own family, weren't finished unraveling that same Thursday. Not by a long shot. Word travels fast in a town the size of Tipton, faster than any of us wanted it to. By the following Monday, I had heard it come back to me in 3 separate versions across the counter of the shop, each one a little more twisted than the last. The way a story always gets twisted, passing hand to hand through a town that loves nothing better than a family coming apart in public. One version had me suing my own brother. Another had Cole facing criminal charges, which wasn't true, not the way this played out. Grady Pruitt set the record straight for me more than once without my even asking him to. Standing at the parts counter telling whoever would listen that Earl Garrity had simply kept his own books straight, and his daughter had simply read them. That there wasn't a lawsuit or a crime in that. Only a father who'd seen his son clearly and loved him anyway, right up to writing him a door out he'd chosen not to walk through. I didn't correct any of it beyond that. I didn't need the whole town to understand exactly what happened at that title company. I only needed the people who mattered to understand it, and they already did. The probate hold went into the county system that same afternoon, filed by Walt himself before 4 o'clock. The house closing pushed back a full week first, and then it collapsed entirely a second time. Because once the title company's own attorney ran the numbers properly, the sale proceeds were now tied up directly behind my brother's documented debt to the estate. There was no clean money left over at all for Cole to funnel anywhere, let alone toward a lender waiting on him in Indianapolis. 3 weeks after that Thursday, I got a call from a woman named Patricia Voss. She introduced herself as a case officer over at Rennick Capital Partners. She asked politely whether I had any information regarding funds Cole Garrity had represented as forthcoming from an estate settlement. I told her, level and even, that I was not able to discuss estate matters, and that she should direct any further questions to Walt Hendricks. I gave her the number. I hung up the phone and sat with my coffee a long minute, because some part of me understood I had just watched the last plank get pulled out from under my brother's whole showroom. I felt almost nothing about it at all, which surprised me more than the phone call itself had. 6 weeks after the signing, the balloon note on Garrity Custom came due in full, with nothing behind it to feed it. The shop with the painted chrome flame across its front window went into the lender's formal review, and not long after that, it stopped belonging to my brother in any real sense at all. I heard, secondhand, through a mechanic I'd known since high school who'd picked up part-time work there, that Rennick's people had walked through the showroom floor with a clipboard on a Tuesday morning and started tagging equipment. Cole hadn't shown up to be there for any of it. Walt called me the same week with the last of it. The county recorded the deed transfer on the shop and the land under your name alone this morning, he said, free and clear, exactly the way your father wrote it. The probate court closed the file on the advance dispute. Officially, on the record, Cole owes the estate its balance. There's nothing left in the estate to argue with anymore, because the estate paid itself back out of his own third before a dollar of it ever reached his hand. He paused a moment on the line. Your father would have hated that it had to happen in a room full of strangers. He would not have hated that it happened at all. I know, I said. One more thing, Walt said. The forgiveness clause. the one that would have restored anything Cole paid back voluntarily before the estate closed. He never used it, never called my office, never offered a dime back on his own before Thursday morning. I know that too, I said. I watched the door stay shut the whole time I was standing right next to it. My sister called me a full month after the signing, quiet on the line in a way I had genuinely never once heard from her before. She asked if I would sit down and help her actually understand the real ledger lines, the true ones, not whatever version Cole had been repeating at family dinners for 2 straight years. I told her I would, and I did exactly that. The two of us sitting together at the same kitchen table on Delphi Pike, the green books spread open between us, working through every single entry to the penny. That turned out to be the first genuinely honest afternoon my sister and I had spent together in almost 20 years. Dana didn't apologize that first afternoon. Not outright, not in so many words. I hadn't expected her to. What she did instead was quieter, and in its own way, it meant more. She started showing up. She came by the shop on a Saturday in March with 2 coffees from the diner on the square and sat on the stool with the dent in it while I worked, not saying much, just present. The way you sit with somebody when you don't yet know how to say the actual thing you mean. By April, she was asking real questions about the ledger lines instead of just nodding along, wanting to genuinely understand the difference between an advance and a gift, wanting to know why our father had done it the way he did it. I answered her plainly every time, the way I would answer anyone willing to actually listen. I did not make her grovel for it. Grace withheld 2 long turns into its own kind of cruelty, and I had watched enough cruelty in that family already to want any part of adding more of it myself. She told me, one of those Saturdays, sitting with her coffee going cold, that she'd known about the $40,000 loan 2 years back, the very first one. She'd said nothing at the time, because Cole had asked her not to. Some part of her had been glad it was him drawing the money down and not her. I appreciated her saying it out loud more than I let on. It cost her something to admit it plainly, and I have learned that the honest cost of a thing usually tells you whether the person paying it means what they're saying. By May, Dana had started coming in 2 mornings a week to answer phones and handle the front counter, not because I'd asked her to. Because she'd asked me, standing in the doorway with her coat still on, if there was anything useful a woman with a business degree and no experience turning a wrench could actually do around a shop like this. I told her the books needed a second set of eyes now that it was a real business again, and not just me keeping myself sane in a dead man's building. I taught her how Dad had always done it. Cash and pen and no shortcuts. She picked it up faster than I expected, careful in a way I hadn't known she had in her. We didn't talk much about Cole those mornings. Some silences you let sit, because filling them too soon just makes them louder. Cole did not call for a long while. When he finally did, it was late June, and his voice on the phone sounded thinner than I had ever once heard it, all the easy Sunday warmth gone clean out of it. He said the shop up in Indianapolis was finished, fully absorbed into whatever Renix people intended to do with the fixtures and the lease. He'd taken work turning wrenches for another outfit 2 towns over, entry-level pay. Nobody there knowing or caring who his father had been. He didn't apologize either. Not in so many words. Not that first call. What he said instead was that he hadn't understood, sitting in Walt's office 14 months before our father died, what he was actually putting his name to. I told him, level as I could manage, that Dad had given him every chance to understand it. 4 separate times, over 2 years. Understanding was never the part that had been missing. Listening was. He was quiet a long moment on the line after that. Then he said, low, that he remembered Dad's hand on his shoulder the day of that first advance. That Dad had said, This one's a loan, son, same as any bank. Cole said he'd nodded along and signed and never once thought about it again until Walt read it back to him at that table. I told him I believed that. I also told him belief didn't undo the $460,000. It didn't undo 9 years of him treating the shop like a punchline while I kept its books to the penny. It didn't undo one rusted key slid across a kitchen table with a cruel sentence attached to it the morning after we buried our father. He said he knew that too. We didn't solve the whole of it on that one call. I'm not sure two people solve 20 years of a family in a single phone conversation. But it was a start, and starts are worth something, even small ones, even late ones. He called again in July, then again in August, a short call about nothing much, just to say he'd landed a second job doing weekend inspections for a used lot 2 towns over, on top of the wrench work. He didn't ask me for anything. I noticed that. 9 years of my brother calling me, and every single call before that spring had a favor folded somewhere inside it, a ride, a loan, a word put in with somebody. These calls didn't. He just wanted to talk, awkward and short, like a man relearning a language he'd let go rusty. I let him. I didn't rush him past the awkward part. Some things heal slow, on their own schedule, and pushing them just tears the same seam back open. The Marlene Doss lien took longer to untangle than anything else that spring. Walt handled it the way Walt handled everything, patient and unhurried, filing the right motions, letting a title company attorney and a probate judge sort out whose claim actually stood ahead of whose. By June, the county recorder's office had it resolved the plain way these things usually resolve. The debt attached permanently to Cole personally instead of to the house, and the house itself finally cleared to sell once the estate's own claim against Cole's third had been satisfied first. It sold in August to a young family from Kokomo with 2 kids and a dog for $485,000. Once Cole's $460,000 in advances and the estate's legal costs were subtracted from his third, the way the will said they had to be, what was left over for him came out to $11,200. Dana's third came to $198,000 untouched. Mine came to the same, plus the shop and the building and the land it sat on, free and clear, exactly as the will had always said. I did not gloat over the number. I want to be plain about that, because there's a version of a person who would have, and I didn't want to be her. I wrote Cole's $11,200 into a certified check myself, the same week the house closed. I drove it to the apartment he was renting above a laundromat 2 towns over. I handed it to him at the door instead of mailing it. Some things you deliver in person, even when the person receiving them has made it hard to want to. He looked at the check a long time before he took it. He said, "Thank you," quiet, and for once in his life he didn't try to make it sound like more than it was. I told Dana about it that same week, sitting at the counter with her ledger work spread in front of her. She didn't say anything for a second. Then she asked if I'd have done the same for her, if the numbers had run the other way, if she'd been the one holding the ruler instead of Cole. I told her the truth. I didn't know. I'd never had to find out, because she'd never taken anything that wasn't hers to take. She looked at me a long moment after that, and something in her face eased, like a woman setting down a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. We didn't say much else about it. Some things don't need more words put on them once they're understood. I also did one more thing that spring, something nobody had asked me to do, and something the will didn't require of me at all. Grady Pruitt's produce route had gone under the winter before, a bad contract with a distributor that folded and took 6 months of his invoices down with it. He'd never once mentioned it to me, not directly, because Grady Pruitt is not a man who asks. I found out from the diner waitress, the way you find out most things in a town the size of Tipton. I paid off the $2,200 he still owed on his own truck's transmission, work my father had done for him on credit the year before he died and never gotten around to billing in full. I told the finance company to mark it settled in Earl Garrity's name, not mine, because it felt like finishing a sentence my father had left hanging. Grady found out about it from the bank, not from me, and he drove straight to the shop with his cap in his hand. He stood in the bay doorway, not saying anything for a good 10 seconds, before he managed to get a single word out. "Your daddy used to do things like that," he finally said. "Never told a soul." I always wondered how many people in this town owe that man something they don't even know they owe. "More than a few, I expect," I said. "You're cut from the same steel," Grady said, and put his cap back on, and left before either of us had to make anything more out of it than it already was. I thought about that line for a long while after he'd gone. Cut from the same steel. 9 years I'd spent believing my whole family had already decided what I was. The useful one. The one you could hand the junk to and count on to say okay. Turned out the only person whose opinion had ever actually mattered had decided something else entirely, and had gone to the trouble of proving it in the one material that doesn't lie. The one language he'd bothered to teach only me. The whole quiet architecture of his last year, the advances, the weld, the pencil note, had been built around that one plain fact, and I hadn't seen the shape of it until it was already finished and waiting for me to walk in. Sue Ann Fowler came back in that June with her boy strapped in the back seat. No check engine light this time, just an oil change she didn't strictly need yet. She sat on the same stool while I worked and told me the whole town had a version of the story by now, most of it kinder to me than I probably deserved. I told her the truth was plainer than any version going around. A father kept good books, a daughter read them. She said that was exactly the kind of plane that made a story last in a place like Tipton, longer than any of the loud ones ever did. I didn't have much to say back to that. I just kept turning the wrench, and she watched me work the way you watch somebody you've decided you trust, and neither one of us felt any need to fill the quiet with more than that. I had the sign out front of the shop redone that same spring, once the dust from the signing had genuinely settled. The old one had simply read Garrity Auto in my father's own block letters. I had the sign man match those exact letters, same red, same spacing down to the inch, and I had him add one single word underneath. So it now reads, Garrity and Daughter. I stood out in the gravel lot on Ash Street and watched him hang it level against the building. Then I walked back inside, where a clean bench was waiting, and a torch was waiting, and the toolbox sat square on the bench top, with its lid still cut clean along my own father's original line. I lit the torch and laid a fresh bead down along the bench leg, slow, exactly the way he had taught me to years ago. The spark fan pooled bright against the concrete floor, and a moment later quietly went out on its own.